Welcome everybody to SynBioBeta Live. Happy Monday morning from a sunny California. It's a very special town hall we have today with Drew Endy, who's a professor at Stanford and founder of the BioBricks Foundation and the iGEM competition. As usual, we want to know where you're dialing in from today. So if you want to type it in the chat box and welcome everybody, then we will welcome you back in return. It's a live Q&A, so if you have particular questions for Drew, we're going to be taking a lot of questions at the end. You can type them into the Q&A box. You probably know the rules by now. Type them into the Q&A box and raise your hand if you want to come on live and speak to Drew and open up your video. You can do that as well, but you don't have to. Or I can ask the question for you. Now, we want to start with a little poll this morning as we're welcoming everybody. There's a couple of questions that I'm going to put up on the screen. Of course, today isn't all about the coronavirus and COVID-19, but a lot of the Q&A is going to be about that. And we want to know if our listeners, our viewers, have been tested already for the coronavirus. So answer the first question if you've been tested already. And the second question is only for the people who have not been tested. So if you haven't been tested, do you actually think that you've had the virus already? So we're interested to see those results and they'll come in. And as I'm looking at the chat box, we've got folks in San Diego, Pia from Blue Yard in Zurich. Hi, guten Morgen or guten Abend. Joe from Aspen, dialing in. Good to see you, Joe. Joe Nevin. Somebody from Nottingham in the UK, Benedict Claxton Stevens. That's a name and a half, Benedict. I'm impressed. Juan Carlos from Madrid. Wow, we have an international crowd joining us today. Montpellier from France. Excellent. A lot of Europeans tuning in, and somebody from Bolivia. Stephen Lamb from ZBiotics in San Francisco. Hi, Stephen. I hope you are doing well. And I know, I'm sure sales in probiotic hangover cures have slowed as a few people are having raging nights on the town, but I still hope that business is well. And Stefan from Denmark, a lot of Europeans. Unsurprisingly, we haven't done one of these on a Monday morning before, and I think California is still a little bit asleep right now. But, so I want to see the results of the poll. Nobody has been tested. Oh, that's a depressing surprise. And out of the people who have not been tested, 4% of you think that you have had it. 32% think maybe. That's actually quite significant, large number. So about 1/3 of the people think, think that you've had it, and 64% do not. So excellent. Well, thank you for that interactive poll. We're going to get right on with the town hall this morning. And as I said, Drew Endy is a professor at Stanford, and his vision for making biology a true engineering discipline is at the core of our community, our synthetic biology community. And I'm going to be talking today about where synthetic biology has passed Drew's expectations and the work that remains to be done. What's his outlook on the coronavirus response, and how can we better connect our scientists together with our social aims. And we're going to be talking about what his experience tells him about the outlook for the future relationship between society and synthetic biology. And most importantly, what are the trends that he's seeing over the next 5 years. Drew, it's an honor to have you on SynBioBeta Live. Welcome.
John, thanks so much. It's great to be here with you and everybody.
So I want to get right in, and I want to take us back through a moment in history. You're one of the founders of the field of synthetic biology. I want to go back into that dark room somewhere 20 plus years ago, where there's a big switch on the wall, a big lever that says synthetic biology, and I think you grabbed it and kind of turned it on. Can you just describe where was that, when was that, and how did it happen?
It's interesting to think back to. There are a couple different switches on that wall, and a number of different types of people grabbed them all at the same time. And so that's one of the things that was and is still most interesting to me. So for example, in my case, I cut my teeth on biology as an engineer, learning how to represent biology on a computer. What later became known as systems biology, but at the time, there wasn't the Institute for Systems Biology up in Seattle that Lee Hood had started. That came later. And as I got deeper and deeper into the representation of natural biological systems in computational models, you quickly come up against the limit of what you can do. And very specifically, I got into situations where I would use my computer-based model to make predictions about what would happen if I changed the genome systematically the natural biological system. This would be in 1994, 1996, 1998. And so we're talking about things like bacteriophage and E. coli and so on. And I would make predictions about what happens when I would redesign things. I'd go into the lab to make changes to test my predictions. Predictions like, wow, if I move the T7 RNA polymerase gene from where it is on the genome to a different spot, maybe I could make a mutant of bacteriophage T7 that grows even faster than the wild type. And the long story short is, all my trivial predictions of how I could take a natural system and make it less fit, make it grow more slowly, those all came true in the lab when I made those derivatives and did those experiments. But the non-trivial predictions that you could take presumably a highly optimized reproducing natural system and make it even faster, make it even higher fitness, those also in the lab were all lower fitness. And so as an engineer, when the bridge falls down, you do a failure analysis. So when my systems biology-based model failed to enable me to make accurate predictions, did a root cause analysis of the failure. And it turns out there were 3 failure modes for me. The first was the physics engine that we use to represent the dynamic behavior of cellular systems isn't really solid, and it wasn't at the time, it's still not. So you might abstract biology at the cellular scale into linear algebra or differential equations. All of space disappears from the model. That doesn't make any sense. It's a practical abstraction, but not correct. The second is, I don't know what all the parts are doing in these best studied natural biological systems. Whether it was a phage at the time or a minimal synthetic genome, it's still crazy. Like 1/3 of the genes that are there, nobody knows what they do. And how am I going to model this thing? And so that was daunting. And then the third thing that was really killer for me was this thing was evolved. And so when you look at the details of the genetic code, you see things like cryptic genetic elements nested inside other ones. You have no idea how to decouple them. You can't really move things around cleanly. You can't make independent changes without it. It's like driving your car. You increase the volume on the stereo and the steering wheel moves because they're coupled. It's like crazy to think about how. So anyway, I remember being in Berkeley at the time. It was probably 1999, and just blurting out. I think Jeff Way, Pam Silver's husband, was my coworker sitting at the computer terminal next to me. Like if I'm ever gonna have a chance of modeling biology, I'm gonna have to rebuild the living world in order to make it modelable. Like evolution is not selecting for designs that are easy to understand, easy to measure, easy to model. And so that led to the idea of refactoring and so on and so forth. To your question though, right, that was the switch I pulled. Like in order to model biology, I'm gonna have to rebuild biology. But many people had different switches, totally different switches. And that's what's so cool to me about the founding of synthetic biology. It has many sources, points of origin. Tom Knight, when I started broadcasting the message, oh, hey, by the way, we might have to rebuild the living world, circa 1999, was at 21 years ago. The only person who's returning a coherent signal is Tom, out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's like, oh yeah, of course, right? The code's 4 billion years old. It's time for a rewrite. I'm like, who's this guy? And it turns out he was the guy who's thinking about manufacturing computers and how to architect in a atomic scale the precise positioning of dopant molecules in semiconductors so that as the features get smaller and smaller and smaller, Poissonian noise doesn't produce materials that don't have semiconductor properties. And the only way to do atomic scale precision manufacturing is to grow it, biology, right? So it's a manufacturing platform and the motivation of making things. And then Tom's meta motivation of it's hard to work with biology as an engineer. So we have about how nature works by building it. So there's at least parts to the answer. One is the etymological landscape was occupied already. Dictionary was full. So genetic engineering, check, done. Metabolic engineering, check, done. Not done as in the field's fully advanced, but it's just already existing and not inclusive of these new things. Rob Carlson and I did some experiments about what to call what we were doing, and mostly they failed. The best failure was when we decided to call what we were doing intentional biology. As a physicist and engineer, we wanted to work together to understand biology well enough to reshape it fully in accordance with human intention. And we even had a website called intentionalbiology.org that maybe is in the Wayback Machine or something if you can find it. And we were pretty excited about that. We're gonna do intentional biology. Within about a week, we got destroyed by a cultural immune response from the biologists we work with, because implicitly we were accusing all biologists of doing unintentional biology because we were doing intentional. We didn't mean that, but that's what happened. When we were talking about what we were doing, I still remember a conversation. This would be back at the then Molecular Sciences Institute above the C's Candy Store in Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley. Carlos Bustamante, a chemist from Berkeley, came down and we were chatting, and he was listening to what we were talking about, and he said, why don't you, that sounds like synthetic chemistry, but with biology, why don't you call it synthetic biology? And, you know, off it went. So that's not a law of nature to come up with that name, but that's honestly part of it. The other thing that shows up, but doesn't show up till later, is when we organized Synthetic Biology 1.0. And that would have been 2004, excuse me, at MIT. And what that revealed was the industry of biotechnology, as well as the academic practice of biotechnology, tends to be going extinct. So the demands that show up on the doorstep of biotechnology practitioners are compelling and overwhelming in urgency. And what that selects for over time is a persistent risk of underinvesting in the tools and workflow and fundamental ways of practicing biotechnology. We have a very hard time collectively of sustaining investments in tooling improvements. So when we organized SB1, one of the most significant things we did was we celebrated a community of tool developers, of workflow improvers, and we needed to give that a new space culturally, such that people could find a home. I still remember when a lab came to the meeting and the PI from the lab showed up afterwards, after SB1. This was a lab super famous for zinc finger engineering. And the PI comes up and goes, thank you so much for bringing everybody together for SB1. I'm like, why? It's just a meeting. He's like, no, you don't understand. Every week in my group meeting, I had to justify to all the graduate students why it was important to get better at engineering proteins to bind DNA. They didn't think anybody cared about that, but this meeting taught them that there's at least 300 people who think it's super cool to get better at the practice of biotech. And so when you do something that's culturally new, it doesn't necessarily matter what you call it, but you have to call it something so that people have a place and space. Yeah.
So if I can summarize, and actually while I'm summarizing, let's put up another poll, please, Kevin. If we can put up the poll, which is, what's your familiarity with synthetic biology? Are you a beginner, intermediate, or advanced in your understanding and knowledge of synthetic biology? Because I think that's going to help Drew and I as we go down these various rabbit holes of who actually is the audience. We have over 200 people tuning in live, and I'll remind you that this is a live Q&A, and I see we've got a few questions coming in already. You can vote up the questions that you think I should ask, and you can come online live and ask the question after we get through some of the questions that I have for Drew. So in summary, you're saying that the field of genetic engineering was doing some genetic engineering, but not particularly applying engineering principles to what they were doing. The field of systems biology was a scientific pursuit, trying to understand why things happened in a biological cell. And you saw this niche of synthetic biology. And there goes the poll, so people can answer that poll. You saw the niche of synthetic biology as a new field that could be defined, which was a foundation.
So that's published in 2005, I think, in Nature, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
That paper is a derivation and representation of the 2003 Darpa synthetic biology study. And I just want to acknowledge that for a couple of reasons. If you go to the MIT Digital Library, DSpace, and search for 2003 synthetic biology study, you can see the actual briefing slides that I gave to the director of DARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, in October of 2003. And the reason I'm belaboring that is because there were about 50 people who we worked with from 2001 to 2003 to pose and respond to the question, how should we think about systematically improving the processes by which we engineer living matter? So that was the question we posed, and we posed that question to an amazing team of biologists and engineers and others. And what comes out of that study are basically three ideas. And within Foundations for Engineering Biology, the paper you've circulated, you'll see those three ideas elaborated and represented again. So the ideas are as follows. First, disaggregate the workflow, starting with decoupling of design and fabrication, specifically by getting better at DNA synthesis. So John, you could become the architect of a DNA system, and I could become the general contractor making that DNA and giving it back to you, right? Or in this case, it might be Emily Leproust and her team at Twist, serving as the constructors of our DNA designs, where the designs could come from anybody on the Zoom here. That was idea number one, disaggregation of workflow so that you get specialization of labor. At the time, most practitioners of biotechnology and genetic engineering tended to have to become experts in both design and construction and testing, which meant that it's just harder to get to the starting line. And you have very highly skilled workers who might be expert in design, but they're spending 80% of their time just building and testing. So disaggregation of workflow to unlock the power of separation of specialty. That idea has gone forward relatively well. So, when I first started ordering DNA for students in 2003, ordering a gene length fragment of DNA was $4 a base pair. One gene would be $4,000 to make it from scratch. But today we're now, below 10 cents on average, I would say, for the better providers. It's about 100-fold reduction. It's a little bit alarming that price seems to have stalled in terms of its improvement over the last couple of years, but we can get back to that. There were two other ideas, though, in that 05 paper. The second idea was to coordinate labor through standards, such that what you make and describe where you are could be readily reused by me over here, now or later, or Jacob Gershon over wherever he is later, and so on, or Ted Anton, vice versa. So standards are ways of coordinating labor, supporting reliable reuse of materials and measurements. That mostly has not taken off, except within institutions. So big corporations that are doing prototyping of organisms like Ginkgo or Zymergen almost certainly have an internal wetware code base that's supporting reuse. But outside of the iGEM competition, there's not a lot of extra institutional direct reuse. What's interesting about COVID, though, is it's stimulating new types of reuse of materials and revealing how standards can help again. The third idea is abstraction, the management of complexity by organizing how biochemical functions are architected such that you don't have to sweat all the details. So for example, CRISPR is the most popular one. CRISPR is basically an abstracted function for causing things to interact with DNA. You just change the guide RNA and you interact with DNA in a different way. And also by tuning the Cas whatever molecule, you'll get different functions. But you could also have higher order functions like an analog to digital converter that takes in a continuously varying transcription signal and flips DNA or not, depending on the value. And rather than telling you about all the biochemistry of all the DNA binding proteins and enzymes and whatnot, I just say, hey, John, here's an analog to digital converter. You're going to love it. That's what abstraction's about. These second and third ideas are mostly not realized at all in biotechnology. And that's not a complaint, it's an observation. And mostly what it is related to is there's not overwhelming demand for it because there's so much people can do with what you can access within relatively small teams, whether that team's a sub-team in a big company or a startup. But
The,
if you, so I would just ask, if you really believe in that engineering framework, I do, in the context of where we have to get to. We have a lot of work to do on enabling coordination of labor and enabling abstraction to manage functional complexity. There's very few groups working on that. And it's not clear to me that industry actors would be incentivized or rewarded to do it. So that's a big opportunity for other sources of funding to step in, I would say.
so what can we do? What
States and in partnership with some colleagues in Europe, the Netherlands, and EU broadly. One of the reasons we're interested in building cells is because the number of moving parts in a cell from a gene perspective is of order 500. And suddenly that gets you to a scale of effort that requires coordination of labor. It also has enough complexity that it incentivizes managing that complexity. So strategically, from a tool developer perspective, I'm keen on building cells because they force us to explore advancing standards and abstraction as core ideas. There's other reasons to be keen on building cells, but in the spirit of the '05 fundamentals paper, I'll just leave it there for now.
And then we've got a couple of questions that I want to be able to get to about education and outreach. You're big on education and outreach. Was the comic book Adventures in Synthetic Biology, which, if we're able to, Kevin, can we bring that up on your screen in a second to show folks? Did that come out in the same issue of Nature as the other paper that we're talking about?
Yeah, that was the cover. And then they published it online, and it's probably still on the Nature website. I was disappointed that Phil Campbell didn't run it as a spread inside the issue, because I think a lot of people just saw the cover, if you will, like the first panels of it, and didn't go deep into it. The comic itself arose because of a teaching challenge we had, wherein we were failing to help students learn about this idea of abstraction. And so we implemented a comic book to figure that out, how to teach it. That's the third chapter in this comic book. When we engaged the artist who did the storyboarding and rendered the actual comic itself, he started with that third chapter, but then declared, I don't understand what you're talking about. I refuse to complete the project unless you add additional material that will make this accessible to a person on the street. And so we backfilled, Isadora Deese and I backfilled chapters 2 and 1, such that the beginning starts with no prior knowledge of DNA. But it was really it was really motivated by chapter 3. The idea of a common signal carrier is useful for making abstracted transcription devices that caused us to, yeah, Kevin, if you just go down to page 2, right? We're just starting from the beginning. But the deeper you get into this, there's a pretty subtle piece of engineering theory buried at the end. You can find this free online as well. You don't have to go through Nature. We retain the copyright, and it's free online through Open Wetware. And I think there are probably 10 different language translations as free downloads. Yeah.
And sorry, I remember getting it and thinking, that's cool, that's cute, that's a way to explain biology to kids. And I didn't actually read it until probably 2 years afterwards. I actually had a paper.
Yeah, stop, Kevin, stop right there on common signal carriers, right? This is why we did it, was to get this idea across, which is incredibly challenging for us to work with students to help them learn about.
So that's chapter 3.
That's chapter 3. It was just strategic blunder on my part to publish a esoteric engineering concept in the 3rd chapter of a comic book with no DOI number or anything like that. But live and learn.
So just looking at the poll results, we've got about 1/3 beginner, about half, 40% intermediate, and 30% advanced. So I think we're pitching this conversation level at the right point. I'm also curious, for a poll, how many people here online had read that comic book before we set it out this morning? And then a second one, I'd like to know who found it inspiring, because certainly I found it inspiring when I first came across it. So okay, let's come back to current affairs, I'm going to repeat a question from an earlier town hall with George Church. Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. What didn't we learn from 102 years ago with the 1918 flu that we can and that we should have learned?
I think that's been covered well. You know, people have explored that. I'd like to draw a different historical analogy.
Sure.
But what I mean is, you can readily search online and find stories about how cities responded differently to the influenza pandemic, how they mitigated public gatherings or not, what arose therefrom consequentially, and so on. So there's a lot of analysis of that. I've been working with a PhD student here, Jonathan Kayas, on exploring a different historical analogy, that of Sputnik. So the launch of a satellite by the Soviet Union in the late 1950s, and how that, quote unquote, took the world by surprise, that the Soviet Union had accomplished this technical feat. And what's really interesting is that there is analysis of the press prior to the launch of Sputnik, the coverage of what was happening in the Soviet space program and other space programs in the US, most notably, but the Soviet space program particularly. And apparently, if you were paying attention to the news prior to the launch of Sputnik, years in advance, you could read about the advances in the Soviet space program and the fact that they were communicating that they were going to launch a satellite. And even some of the reports in the New York Times and elsewhere include things like the statistics, the characteristics of the satellite, about how big it was going to be, how long it would be in orbit, stuff like that. Yet, nevertheless, when Sputnik launches, it's a big surprise. So what can we learn from that experience? And how does that apply to the experience we have now, the COVID experience? So the experience of Sputnik in the United States, for example, led to the following conclusion. We don't like being surprised as a nation. We wish to never be surprised again by another nation, especially with respect to technological development. And we so dislike this. It's not that we just dislike it. We're going to do something about it. We're going to get really organized, and we're going to create an entire agency whose only mission is to prevent technical surprise. And this is the origins of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, now known as DARPA. So what are we going to do about the surprise of COVID? Is it a surprise? Certainly not, just like Sputnik was not a surprise if you were paying attention. Whether it's Bill Gates' amazingly presented TED Talk on infectious disease and pandemic from a few years ago, or the Wired article from 5 years ago or so, that's very particular about coronaviruses and China. There's plenty of signal that what's happening right now, if you're paying attention, is not a surprise. It's not a surprise to anybody in public health. It's not a surprise to anybody in biosecurity, biodefense. It's just not a surprise. Yet, we're representing it as a surprise. Why is it okay in epidemiology to be surprised? Why is it okay to take from this experience that once we get on the other side, we're just gonna expect we're gonna be surprised again? Why? The reason to a future, and we come back and look at the trends of synthetic biology, and you ask, well, what's the world going to be like technically in 2030 and 2040 with respect to what people can do with biotechnology? If you are okay with the idea that we respond to public health threats by being on our heels and waiting for a surprise, and then we just try and be as good as we can at finding the surprise, reacting to the surprise, and so on, mitigating the surprise, that's not a strategy at all. It's a losing strategy. So I think the lesson we should really explore historically is the lesson of Sputnik. And I don't mention that to trigger a geopolitical arms race, just the opposite, right? I simply mention that to illustrate when surprised, one meta lesson is to conclude we must never be surprised again, okay? And because when we talk about infectious disease, that's for everybody, all of us all together, it should be taken as a collective action to not be surprised again. So I wanted to mention that. I think 1918, tons of lessons, but since in part we're talking about a technology in synthetic biology, I wanted to use the Sputnik point of reference, and of course others on the call and you know, probably have different perspectives on it, but as a point of reference, there you go.
So I don't think we're going to be going back to normal. And you know, we know that a lot of people are stressed right now, economically stressed about health, stressed about loved ones. I'm starting to see a silver lining on the cloud about some of the transformations that are going to go through our society around online education, around learning, around people, particularly in the Bay Area, many metropolitan cities, not sitting in 2 hours of traffic every day. We're not going back to normal. What are some of the things that you think we're not going to be going back to, or what are some of the things that you're hopeful about coming out of this in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months time, that society will have changed and there'll be things that we can look forward to in our new society that we've rebuilt?
Start with the thing that's right in front of us, this Zoom interface and whatever that's going to become. So on the one hand, you know, infinite loops of Zoom doom. I'm sure many of us interacting this morning have had days in the last month where it's 10 hours of Zoom meetings, and somehow you just got to rip away from the screen and get outside or see a family member and reconnect as a corporeal human, right? So it's challenging to explore this interface and be forced to do it. I was talking with Tina Seelig, an amazing educator and colleague out here in management science and engineering. And she just blew me away the other day by exclaiming how much she loves Zoom as an educator. There's no back row in the classroom suddenly. All your students are right in front of you. If you want to reorganize the class into breakout sessions, click of a button, breakout rooms. Doesn't take 5 minutes to reset the class and bring people back together. These polls, these Q&As that are coming in and the comments in the chat board, it's just amazing. It's a qualitatively better way of interacting that we're just beginning to learn how to interact with. So that's kind of tiny, but a real thing.
And just like Sputnik, these tools were always there, but nobody knew how to use them.
Yeah. So I guess the big ambiguity confronting synthetic biology as an industry, synthetic biology as a community, is where is synthetic biology going to land in the cultural narrative, the structure of the narrative, the stories we tell each other as members of diverse societies post-COVID. And so is synthetic biology going to land in the bucket of, well, biology caused this problem, and synthetic biology sounds like more biology, and sounds like scary biology, and so, right? Or biology caused this problem, but biology is solving this problem, and synthetic biology is the source of better biology, so, right? And that's very simplistic, but one of the things that's up for grabs right now, Jason Kelly and I were talking about this last weekend.
That's CEO of Ginkgo.
Right. So one of the things that's most on my mind in the moment of now and COVID is to live in the year 2030, to live out in the future 10 years from now, and pose the question, what do we wish is true? Like, what do we want to land on by 2030? What do we want to make true by the year 2030 that's not now true? And then if we can figure that out, let's get organized to do it. And you start thinking that way, and now return to your question, well, what does biology have to contribute to the world? Whether it's our societies, whether it's our relationship with nature, our relationships with each other, and so on, the connectedness of things, our industry, our economy, you name it. The thing that's up for grabs right now, and the lesson that everybody's learning, is biology matters. Everybody's being taught that anew. 20 years into the 21st century, everybody on Earth is being taught anew in a profound way that biology matters. So then the question is, how much is biology and biotechnology going to matter over the next decade? And we've all, in a way, since we're on this call, you know, bought into that, I presume, or maybe we're opposed to it, but we're mostly bought into it. But more broadly, enabling entire societies play out. I'll pause for a second because I know I'm sounding, because I am an academic, like an academic, I really want to acknowledge the amazing value and work and effort of industry and leaders and workers in for-profit corporations, both for working in ways that allow for a lot of stuff to happen, but also by enabling people who don't understand biology to see that biology and synthetic biology matter. So to put a point on it, back in October, when the White House hosted a bioeconomy summit to talk about bioscience and biotechnology and synthetic biology, note that it was the bioeconomy summit. It was not the biotechnology summit. It's almost impossible to have a summit politically on biotechnology at that level, but economy you can talk about, because people who don't know about the subject know about jobs and money, and that as a proxy allows people to explore something that might otherwise be esoteric. So I just want to acknowledge how critical and essential the synthetic biology industry is culturally, and how the actions of the industry, both in the immediate, just providing a frame of reference by which others outside biology can appreciate it, are essential, but also how the corporations behave and act, whether they are enabling people to participate in a diverse community that amplifies citizenship, or a community of corporate actors that reconstruct some of the dysfunction that the first generation of genetic engineering inherited.
So we have a few more polls, and then I want to come on to a couple of questions. We got a couple of questions about education. So the first poll is: have you encountered Drew Endy's Adventures in Synthetic Biology comic strip before? We're curious to see that before we send it out this morning. And then we're going to ask if you liked it, if you found it inspiring, and then I want to know if you're currently tuning in from industry or academia or other. That would be interesting to know as well. Justice Walker, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask Drew your question live? And if you just want to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Justice Walker. I'm a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and I focus heavily on synthetic biology and K through 12 education. And so in my work, I think a lot about how we might introduce this field to young learners. And I wonder, Drew, what your opinion is about whether synthetic biology is ready to be introduced to K through 12 learners, and if not, what we need to do to sort of prepare it to whether or not it even fits.
And you should address the poll results in that, Drew, because 69% of people have never seen the comic before. So we need to, I think, republish it.
Anybody's welcome to republish it. I think it's available under Creative Commons with no license fees required. But
let's republish it.
What's old is new again. Justice, it's great to hear you from Philadelphia, and you know, I take inspiration from the work that you and the group you're in does, and on education and related activities. And you know, I see Natalie Keadle and BioBuilder is represented in the chat, along with many other folks who are literally on the front lines of addressing the reality of the question you posed. My answer is yes, totally ready. By totally ready, I don't mean we've got a mature technology base and educational materials, but that's kind of not the point. The thing, for example, that becomes the iGEM comes about because we weren't ready to operate an undergraduate curriculum in bioengineering. We didn't know how to teach teenagers matriculating at MIT how to design and build life forms, and we still don't know how to do that, but we're getting closer. By being honest with students at different levels, you can engage them in the frontier, the curiosity of why can't we do that yet? And that, for students and would-be learners who are excited about discovering, if they're scientifically inclined, that helps them motivate new ways of learning about science. For other types of would-be learners, students who are excited to tinker, to learn by doing, off they go as well. So one of the primary values of synthetic biology from a pedagogical perspective is it engages people in a genuine way at all ages on how for them would they like to learn. See, the thing about enabling somebody to learn is you can't approach it like a banker inserting money into a vault, like a piggy bank, right? That's not how, you don't like push knowledge into somebody's brain. You can try that, but it's called indoctrination when you do that. The much more profound way of enabling learning is to understand with empathy what the learner is motivated to do and learn about, and then from that craft an experience that enables them to do the hard work of learning because they're motivated to learn. They're having fun and arriving at something meaningful. It's been great to see what BioBuilder, for example, is prototyped in partnership with Carolina Biologicals, getting kits out to students. It's been great to see what the iGEM high school track has been able to do. There's so much more opportunity there. It's been great to see what Genentech has been initiating, working through its outreach programs to get biotechnology curriculum in every high school in California, and so on and so on and so forth. And why do this? Well, one is to enable people to do the hard work of learning, but another reason to do this is to enable a citizenry that's capable of accessing one of the dominant means of production for the 21st century, biotechnology. And if we have people have how many people should have the option of learning about biotechnology, in other words? And the answer to that has to be about the same as how many people should have the option of learning to read and write, which is 100%. Everybody should have the option of learning to read and write. So we've got to get these programs scaled at the high school level, and the
in a row now, so it's good to see you, Justice. Jacob, do you want to go ahead and ask your question to Drew? And if you just want to introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from, Jacob.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I hope you all can hear me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a senior studying biomedical engineering at Binghamton University in upstate New York. Next year, I'm actually staying for my 5th year to pursue a master's degree in biomedical engineering. But I'm very interested in synthetic biology, and I'm hoping to pursue my PhD and actually apply this summer. And so I was wondering, as someone who is interested in pursuing their PhD in synthetic biology or a synthetic biology-related field, and also interested in starting a company someday, what advice do you would have for someone like me?
And Drew, before you answer, I just also want to jump in. If the caller was a computer programmer, they wouldn't be asking you whether they should do a PhD and go to grad school. They'd just be applying to Y Combinator and going ahead and starting a company. So do you recommend graduate school? And are we going to get to a stage where Jacob wouldn't need to do a PhD?
You know, Sergey and Larry applied to PhD program and even matriculated. They didn't finish, right? And that's computer science, you know, within the last 2 decades. I think what that reveals is that there's no blanket answer for a question like this, Jacob. And the most important thing is to find a path that's compelling for you personally. And it's very, very easy as a student working through the institutional educational system to feel like your options are quite narrow. Like, oh, there's only a few high-powered research universities, I have to go to one of them, right? Or I've got to do this first and then I do that, but I couldn't explore both. In my limited experience, both personally and advising students and seeing what people do in general, it's way, 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 way more important for people as individuals to realize personal happiness by finding opportunities and paths that are genuine for them. You know, for me, for example, I came out of undergrad, I did a master's degree in environmental engineering coming out of structural engineering mostly. And then I found a very small boutique, if you will, PhD program up at Dartmouth College, which you would think of as an undergraduate liberal arts college primarily. But they had an engineering school with no departments, 30 faculty, and it was a place that had great faculty and quiet but high expectations of its students. And so it was a good place for me to figure out who I was and do things that weren't already pre-approved, as might be found in a much larger university with, you know, big grant throughput and so on. So I would prioritize. I know it's easier to give you like a specific answer, like go to this program, check the box. But I would really prioritize as a reflection back to you and everybody to understand what your motivations are, where and how you realize personal happiness outside of career, and optimize your journey and path on those variables. And inevitably along the way, your interest in synthetic biology and related things will flourish and pull you forward into that profession. There are many, many, many more openings and possibilities. Here's like, for example, at Stanford today, this afternoon, I have to open Introduction to Bioengineering, right? Of order 150 undergraduates. Some of them are first-year undergraduates, some of them are seniors. And one of the things I'm likely to talk about is for the seniors, imagine graduating from college this year. What are your job prospects going to be? It's tough. It's daunting to think about that, to say the least. I think we do have a jobs crisis in bioengineering. We're not going to have enough bioengineers for this decade, by a lot. There's going to be so much bioengineering to do, we're not going to have enough people. Now, most places that would hire bioengineers don't know that they need a bioengineer, and the places might not even exist yet. And so somehow we're going to have to do two things. One, we're going to have to provide air cover at a top level, teaching the world how much bioengineering and biotechnology and synthetic biology matter. But at the grassroots level, we're going to have to explain and enable to people that enable people to find their own way, to make their own jobs, that the job descriptions, the job postings for what they can contribute uniquely to the world simply don't exist. If you're starting your career path by applying for a job, sometimes that's a reasonable thing to do, but in this particular space, it may not be because people don't understand what you can do uniquely. I'm not saying that perfectly well, but it's a different complementary response to your question, meaning the same thing.
Jacob, thank you for the question. We have some amazing questions coming in. Miroslav, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions? And if I'm promoting you to a panelist, if you do want to put your video on, as long as you're not in your pajamas, then please go ahead and do that.
Pajamas are fine. It's the absence of pajamas that would concern me.
That's true. That's true.
Yep. Hi, Drew. How are you?
Where are you coming in from, Miroslav?
From Slovakia. Kind of finished my mandatory quarantine due to the COVID, so it's taking break from my research in the UK.
Hello, Slovakia.
Yeah. Hi there. So what I really wanted to ask is, what should we as synthetic biologists think about as strategic synthetic biology reserve? So many countries have reserves of oil and other resources, but what should every government or even community should possess to be able to deal with so-called biological crisis like the next pandemics? What we should have ready in terms of perhaps knowledge, skills, even chemicals? We are having a lot of problems right here back home. So I would really wonder about this.
A couple things there, and good to see you. So biology promises a way of making many things in a modern context. Right. So to what extent can you do rapid deployment of biosynthesis, biomanufacturing, if you have disruption in international shipping or supply chains? Right. So what can you pivot to source domestically or onshore or within a region or border? Resilience in a manufacturing network. What we've got right now is primarily the inheritance of the 19th century metaphors of industrialization, centralized manufacturing combined with the internet-based logistics. But biology promises distributed manufacturing. We haven't fully advanced biotechnology to support straightforward distributed manufacturing of modern biotechnologies, but getting to that would allow for a lot of local resilience, I would say, and this ties back in part, John, to your BioBuilt framework and that piece you put out, the BioBuilt idea, which I think is correct and quite important. Miroslav, there's
in the comments, Kevin, to see.
Miroslav, there's also the question of where you're getting your DNA from. Does Slovakia have a capacity to print genes? Does Slovakia have a capacity to print genomes? Should it? No. If DNA is the industrial polymer of the 21st century, what is each nation's or region's strategic plan for ensuring it can access that capacity? So it's baffling to me that isn't better addressed everywhere.
So Drew, let's just riff on that a little bit and talk about the rebuilding the California economy. I mean, specifically, we're both in California. California was the first, maybe second state to lock down after Washington. Hopefully we'll be one of the earliest to come out of this. What do we do about starting to rebuild the California economy, thinking about supply chains, thinking about retooling, thinking about re-education for the unemployed, thinking about this vast Central Valley that we have that's the breadbasket producing a lot of corn, but lack of fermentation, scale-up infrastructure. How can we think about global supply chains that we've seen the problems around the inability.
There's the question's charged, John, because of the immediacy of what everybody's talking about and hearing. And I would set most of that aside, not because it's not immediately essential, but because what you're raising as a question is something that plays out over a decade. And so I'd respond on that basis, right? So it's like, what do we need to land? What do we need to land on 2030 with respect to workforce? How many Cal State University programs should have a bioengineering department? How many have one today? Like maybe 2? What about the trade schools, the vocational schools? What about the high schools? As mentioned, the Genentech supported idea from before. Let's get biotechnology as a type of way of learning into every California high school. I've had some really amazing interactions catalyzed by Rolando Cruz with the agricultural commissioner of Monterey County, right? One of the big growing counties, if you will, in California, down around Salinas and so on. So what would it mean to get organized as one of the world's largest economies, California, to implement a 21st century bioeconomy by the year 2030? A couple things, right? So you definitely want to make sure all the conventional stuff was being handled. Fermentation capacity, and I don't mean conventional in a dismissive way. It's critical, it's totally non-trivial. How to facilitate scale up and go to market, you know, coming from an innovation to a practical reality everybody can benefit from. I think we need a lot more attention on that, and I think we begin to see the government responding at a federal level, like the manufacturing innovation institutes coming out of the Defense Department in the US are good examples of that. It'd be great to have a lot more of that at the state level, I think, in different ways. But when you start to think about a decadal strategy, you've got to talk about workforce, which we've already touched upon through education, but you also have to think about strategically, what is synthetic biology really? Not just as a movement or a community, but what might it be technically? And are there any things up for grabs that are qualitatively important? And I think the answer to this, when you stop and scrutinize, is definitely there's some things up for grabs. So we'll come to that in a second. But in between, like scale up and go to market and workforce, there's a whole middle layer of fundamental science, fundamental engineering, and the translation process from the fundamentals to the reality. And you just take California as an example. How many national labs do we have in California? We've got Lawrence Berkeley Labs, which is amazing in biology and biotechnology. We have SLAC, an accelerator laboratory, amazing in physics and measurement and some biomeasurement. But we also have Sandia, right, with its outpost in Livermore, and we have Livermore Labs itself. So we have 4 national labs in the state of California who all are operating in biology and aspire to operate in biology a lot more. What should a national lab look like, or a virtual national lab that integrates all 4 into one mega lab for biotechnology look like? What would it be delivering? Well, it would be delivering world best tooling for biotechnology, the best measurement tools, the best modeling tools, the best manufacturing tools. Without a doubt, if we don't have best tooling, we just won't be in the lead. If you care about stuff like that, right, which I tend to, and so on. And so there's a whole middle layer that I think is right underneath the fervor and fermentation of the economy that needs to get recognized. And coming out of COVID, if there's not a coherent argument about misallocation of public treasure into like really backwards facing ideas around mass on target ballistics, and how about we invest more in living matter as a strategic domain, we've messed up something badly as a group. Let me return to something I'll just make a prediction, which is a biased prediction because I'm going to try and make it happen. I think when 2030 comes around, we're going to be talking about 2 things that we're not really talking about very much. We're going to be talking about the bionet, like the internet, but it's going to be the bionet. And we're going to be talking about the PB, like the PC, but the PB, the personal biosynthesizer. And if you imagine what the BioNet enables, it enables design anywhere, grow everywhere. I think you reflected on that earlier, John. I think that's right. I upload DNA code wherever I design it. I download DNA code anywhere else, and I operate that DNA code on my personal biosynthesizer. That's the BioNet. That requires distributed DNA manufacturing, probably without anhydrous acetonitrile, probably aquatic phase enzymatic synthesis, without phosphoramidites. You can lift the lid on that and figure out how to do that. That seems plausible. When you start thinking about personal biosynthesizer, one of the most amazing things surfacing to me is this idea of the formate bioeconomy. So fermentation and biosynthesis enabled by formate, as opposed to glucose or methane or lignocellulose. Formate's interesting because there's examples of making formate through hydrolysis of water, right? So you can go from a kilowatt hour of electricity to a certain number of grams of formate by fixing carbon from CO2, and then you feed engineered or natural organisms formate and they make biomass. Those things are technically possible within a decade. The reason I harp on electricity is not to discount sugar and other inputs, but if you're following what's going on with electricity generation, you can look at the analysis of the effective return on energy for photovoltaic solar. How much energy does it take to make the solar panel? How long do you need to operate the solar panel to get your energy back? Joules in, joules out. And the effective return on energy for photovoltaic solar has gone greater than 1 and is now averaging somewhere between 8 and 10. Meaning a solar panel in California will make, call it 10 times more energy than was required to make the solar panel. All right, that means if you parse that correctly, we're transitioning to electricity abundant civilization. And now if you can power biosynthesis with electricity, we're no longer limited to photosynthesis alone. So anyway, I really want to highlight there's this middle layer. There's workforce. We gotta advance workforce. If I'm talking to Gavin, I'm talking about workforce and education. I'm also talking about industry and practical needs around working better together to facilitate going to market, both technically and economically. Totally non-trivial. Nobody seems to have solved that at scale, although there's some experiments running. But in between those two things is a core of the sandwich of the bioeconomy, which is doing things in profoundly new ways that will require a tremendous sustained investment in tooling, such that what people can do becomes qualitatively distinct.
Fantastic. Let's make that formate economy a reality here in California and beyond. Drew, we're almost at the hour and we have a lot of questions, 20 questions that we haven't answered. I have 3 people on the line. Would you mind if we just go over a few more minutes and just take those questions, maybe 10 past the hour?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. Ravi, why don't you go ahead and ask your questions? It's related to what Drew was just talking about.
Yeah, hi, Drew. Hi, John. Thanks for the excellent two-day course of the early age of synthetic biology, Drew. My question pertains to the last comment that you made. So when will we actually see a bacterial digital bioprinter so that everything's synthetic, all synthetic, and when a mammalian one?
You want one operating in mammals. I defer to the mammals, the mammal operators. I think I know of about 10 companies that are trying to do enzymatic synthesis of DNA. They all seem to be abiotic in their operation outside of the enzymes themselves. And relatively few of them have moved away from phosphoramidites, but a few have. And so that's, I think, the beginnings of something that can go from information to the polymer of DNA from scratch without a totally crazy supply chain hidden underneath the synthesis process itself. Of course, if I fantasize about the future, the final form of a DNA synthesizer should be an enzyme, a genetically encoded DNA synthesizer. Ideally, this would operate in any organism you could express this enzyme in, and it would be responsive to 3 wavelengths of light, 2 to set the base and 1 to allow for a base to be added or not. And so that could be operated in pick your favorite organism. You would no longer worry about transfection or transformation. The DNA would be instantiated inside the organism itself. Editing and so on is kind of a step towards that, but not exactly what I'm talking about. I'd look to this genetically encoded synthesizer as the ultimate answer to your challenge. But I think in between that and today, there's very practical work in companies like Templa Nucleics and others, where they're trying to get aquatic phase synthesis of DNA that could operate in a tube or a microfluidic device without strange chemical supply chain inputs.
Great, thank you, Ravi. Desiree, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, I'm Desiree. I'm studying bioengineering at Berkeley right now. And I have to say that like SynBioBeta and Drew, your TED Talk were probably one of the really big reasons why I wanted to become a synthetic biologist. It really turned like an interest in biology into an interest in bioengineering. And my question for you was that, like, given COVID-19, we've begun to see the anti-vax community not take as big of a stage as they used to. Like, either people are coming around or the media is giving them less airtime, because clearly, like, the science behind the pandemic is what people are getting behind. So I was wondering, do you think this will translate into, like, as we're not returning to the old normal, will our new normal be like more acceptant of scientific things like climate change or synthetic biology that people traditionally have not gotten behind?
Desiree, thanks so much for your question. That's a really profound question. I think it's up to you. I think it's up to us. My default prediction would be the relaxation of the conversation as mediated by the press will return to what it was before. It's not that people, I would guess, who are opposed to vaccines or concerned about vaccines have stopped being concerned about vaccines. It's just other things in the news cycle are much more profound and dominating, if that makes sense. So I think it really is. I think that's always going to be there, right? I think there's always going to be that skepticism of knowledge, of human ingenuity, of humans acting according to our intentions and the responsibility that comes along with that. People are appropriately nervous about that because it can be abused and misused. So I don't think that ever goes away. I think the question becomes, do we complement it with something in addition that's overwhelming in its awesomeness? Do we have a telos, a collective narrative and aspiration for what we want to get to, that will allow for orders of magnitude more people to recognize and celebrate and engage in the positive aspects of this. Let me just offer a specific point of reference that you could use to track how the relaxation is going, hopefully soon, but maybe not as soon as we wish for. So I wonder how many people have received from a relative or a family member a news story about the question of whether COVID-19 was made by humans. Is it really a naturally emerging infectious disease?
Why don't we just ask that in a poll? How many
Yeah.
people online have been asked by somebody, was it bioengineered or natural? But sorry to interrupt, continue, Drew.
Yeah, so I've just, for myself, I've probably gotten that question inbound 3 times from close friends or relatives, and very interesting news stories, well written, is it part of a geopolitical propaganda campaign from a third nation state, not the US or China? Maybe, how would I know? What's very interesting about this experience is, in particular, it reveals that it's possible to target bioweapons, not on the basis of, I'm not saying COVID-19 is a bioweapon, just to be clear, but it's possible to imagine targeting bioweapons, not on the basis of scientific or technical prowess, but on the vulnerabilities of a society to public health risks. And I never really appreciated that. I always thought that the risk of bioweapons, which have been retarded from being adopted, because if I release a bioweapon, I can't prevent myself from being hurt. But if there's a nation state that can't operate a reliable public health system, and culturally my nation state can, then my oppositional nation state is vulnerable to biology in a way that I'm not. So suddenly you can quickly take this conversation and move it into a domain that's very Hobbesian. State of nature is a state of war. People don't trust each other. People will hurt each other. And you could imagine, Desiree, better than I, right, that if that type of narrative slips into the normal discussion, becomes normalized without good reason, I think, we're back to pre-COVID chit-chat, right, which probably won't help very much.
But maybe instead of the NBA stars, we'll have the science stars at that point.
Could be.
Claire Hilberger, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Drew. Hi, John. Thanks for putting this on this morning. I'm in the Chicago area. I just graduated from Northwestern. I was wondering, kind of going back to what you said earlier about the U.S. quote unquote being surprised by this, even though that might not actually be the case. What other surprises do you believe that the U.S. is waiting on that the synthetic biology community can work to tackle preemptively? So whether that be maybe like environmental or something like that.
Claire, that's a great question. I think there's a number of surprises that are playing out collectively that we're not recognizing as surprises. So by way of example, I mentioned one in passing, the fact that it appears to me that civilization is transitioning to electricity abundance. What does it mean to be an electricity abundant civilization? What surprises does that unlock? Well, you see the possibility of electrofermentation, electrobiosynthesis. Anywhere on land ever again. How much electricity would it take to run reverse osmosis and pumping to an average elevation of 1,000 meters to provision the entire landmass of the Earth with fresh water? The natural freshwater cycle is solar powered, right? So we know it's doable. It's just how much energy is it? And the napkin math suggests it's about 20 terawatts of power. 20 terawatts is interesting because that's about how much an energy civilization now uses. Stated differently, if you only double civilization's energy supply, you could run artificial freshwater. So hidden above these types of vignettes is a real possibility. What if we could transition civilization from living on the planet to living with the planet? If you're familiar with Star Trek, the TV series, I think of this as Earth Trek. Like, we've just figured out how to operate the supply of joules, bits, and atoms, the energy, the knowledge, and the stuff, sufficient to supply 10 billion people without trashing the place. And that's actually surprising when you lift the lid on that and get to that possibility. But it looks like we can deliver on that technically. The puzzles, which is part of the surprise, is that the institutions we inherit, whether they be companies, governments, universities, they were developed in times of scarcity and optimized to maintain stability in the context of scarcity. And so in different ways and to different degrees, they may or may not be able to transition into a flourishing future, as could be unlocked by biotechnology. So if you follow what I'm saying, I'm just going to try and read it back in a simple drawing. A lot of times we think about technology with the metaphor and narrative of exponential growth and Moore's law, more and more computing power, off to the moon, right? And in synthetic biology, we get the exponentials of DNA sequencing and synthesis. So we use the rhetoric of Moore's law. But the surprise implicit in Moore's law is where do we launch into? Where do we land? And it's not clear we have a landing. But imagine a different trend that goes up and down like a roller coaster. And the starting point is where we are as a society, and the ending point is where we want to be. Like, we've just actually made things awesome. You know, I'd rather not fight climate change. I'd rather enable climate awesome. Right? I want to do something positive. Most people want to proactively do something good. So I think if you lift the lid on the possibilities of what biology as a technology represents, if you can secure from an engineering perspective operational prowess with living matter, we actually can pull off some things that have never been done before. And there's implicit surprise all over the place that will require very deft maneuvering, not just of science and technology and economic scale up, but culture and politics.
Thank you very much for that question. Last question to Hannah Jabba. And Hannah, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Hannah, I'm calling from London. I founded GenoBio, which was a vaginal microbiome company to essentially help close the gender health gap that we see. And I think my question is really, how do we ensure that the fruits of SynBio are both owned and realized by the many as opposed to the privileged few?
Great question. And Drew, I hope this gives you a chance to talk a little bit about the BioBricks Foundation and also some of the work that the BioBricks Foundation is doing around COVID-19 as well.
Sure. You know, I'm pausing only to admit how much more there is to do, right? So BioBricks Foundation starts as a placeholder organization to represent the public interest in synthetic biology and biotechnology. Over the years, what we've devoted ourselves to is contributing tools that enable people to share things in common through the public domain. Great collaboration from colleagues in the United Kingdom with open enzymes and pre-positioning useful enzymes in the context of biotechnology into the public domain and as free to use materials that can be redistributed, right, using the open MTA and so on. And you know, anyway, that's been interesting to see. And Andrew Marshall at Nature Biotech has a nice editorial in the current issue on this. By pre-positioning tools for biotechnology in the commons, in the public domain, they're ready to be used when they're needed. In the case of responding to COVID, some of the enzymes in the Open Enzymes project are the enzymes used in diagnostics for amplification of nucleic acids as needed to do testing. And it's just not a coincidence, but we did the homework ahead of time. We were sort of like the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of being prepared by getting these things made and redistributed such that when our lab shut down at Stanford, we had pushed samples out and those nodes could redistribute freely. But in the question is something much more profound, meaning it's not sufficient to just get a tool base into the public domain. It's a question of how people can be enabled to organize themselves and be organized and resourced to do things in biotechnology. You know, just because everybody has access to a technology doesn't solve the problem of access to the technology. It's very interesting to reflect on how capital, for example, in the United States is structured. If you're prototyping a microbe or any type of cell to do something, and now you want to bring it to everybody, you have relatively few ways to organize capital to build a team to scale that up. And the constraints on how the capital is organized mean that you're probably going to make an industrial process that's fine for what it is, but only supplies or provisions to a subset of humanity, about 2 billion people, right? Leaving 5 billion people off the map, so to speak, from your product's perspective. Biology promises the capacity of enabling people anywhere to do what they need wherever they are. And iGEM has explored this a little bit by enabling students with a little bit of tooling, still immature, and a lot of spirit and community to work together on local problems. But I think to really faithfully answer the challenge posed in the question, like how do we make sure that this is a technology platform that reinforces citizenship in a society. So you can structure society as a society of citizens, a society of consumers, a society of subjects, or a society of objects. And I would prefer to live in a society of citizens. And so hidden in this question is what does it mean to deploy biotechnology such that, in my biased way, I'm contributing to and enabling a society of citizens. By citizens, I mean not just I have the right to vote, but I have the right to live a satisfying existence in partnership with others in a way that is stable enough that I have an interest in what I am doing and in the stability of the society overall. So that is not a done deal, is all I'm trying to get to. Not to be dramatic about it, but we are very, very far from securing that type of future in biotech. And what the BioBricks Foundation is doing is just the tiniest of moves to build out some of the public domain tooling that is essential, but grossly insufficient to get there. And if you were to ask me, what else do we need to do? I would say we should start by talking more about it. And I don't have a great answer beyond what we're doing right now.
Great, fantastic. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We had over 200 participants and over 20 questions that we didn't get to, so I do apologize. As usual, we will leave the chat open. If you want to send a message to Drew, just type it into the chat and we'll collate them all and send them on to him at the end of this. Drew, I know you're very busy right now, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on and do this town hall with us and answer the questions. So thank you for everything that you've done, everything that you're doing, and for also setting a bright future and a path forward for the global bioeconomy in everything that you're working on right now. Thank you for joining us today. Really,
John, thank you so much to you and your team for being awesome. I really appreciate everything you all do for the community, and I'm super grateful to all the people who joined this morning and the questions. If it's okay with you, John, and your team, I'd stay on for another 7 minutes just to answer some questions. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'll type them in.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Or what you could do, yeah, or you could stay on. You've got the questions in front of you, so you could that would probably be quicker just to answer them. Just go down
I'm just going to type answers as best I can, and then I'm going to go prep for class.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. Okay.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And later this week, on Wednesday morning at 8:30 a.m., slightly later than normal, we have the Chief Medical Officer of Illumina, who's going to be joining us. And we're also going to have Amanda Cashin from Illumina Accelerator and Gary Schroth from the who is a scientist at Illumina. So Phil Febo is the Chief Medical Officer. So you can join us for a smorgasbord of all-you-can-eat sequencing on Wednesday, and we'll be talking about the response to the global pandemic and particularly sequencing of the globe for all the different viral strains. And then next week, we have some very exciting SynBioBeta Lives talking about investing in synthetic biology, talking about neuroscience and brain-computer interfaces. And a whole lot more things coming the week after. So thank you all. If you're not signed up to the newsletter, you can at synbiobeta.com. And we wish you a great start to the week, and hope everybody does well.